In recent years, there has been growing debate over whether members of Congress and other federally elected officials should be subject to term limits to reduce corruption. One of the primary concerns is the immense wealth accumulated by career politicians despite earning a modest civil service salary. Many of these politicians have profited from insider knowledge, gaining access to critical information about corporate expansions, mergers, government contracts, regulatory actions, and legal proceedings. While insider trading is illegal for most Americans, lawmakers, some of whom serve on committees directly overseeing these matters, often appear immune from consequences. No figure has faced more scrutiny and investigation than one longtime politician whose senior status and chairmanship positioned him as a key player in global financial irregularities and corruption during his time in office. Who is Dick Cheney? Why was he controversial? What was his connection to global corruption?
Hello, I'm Colin Heaton, former history professor, Army and Marine Corps veteran, and welcome to this episode of Forgotten History.
Dick Cheney was born January 30th, 1941 in Lincoln, Nebraska, the son of Richard Herbert Cheney, a soil conservation agent, and Marjorie Lorraine Dickie Cheney. He grew up in Casper, Wyoming. He entered Yale University in 1959 but failed to graduate, and in November 1962, at the age of 21, he was convicted of driving while intoxicated and again arrested for DWI the next year. Cheney said that the arrest made him think about where I was and where I was headed. I was headed down a bad road if I continued on that course. Cheney earned bachelor's and master's degrees in 1965 and 1966 respectively in political science from the University of Wyoming and was a doctoral candidate at the University of Wisconsin, but he never finished that course. He and his wife, the former Lynn Vincent, had two daughters, Elizabeth and Mary. In 1968, Cheney moved to Washington, D.C., and in 1969 worked in the administration of President Richard Nixon, becoming a deputy assistant to President Gerald R. Ford in 1974, and then becoming his chief of staff from 1975 to 1977. In 1978, he was elected from Wyoming to the first of 6 terms in the United States House of Representatives, where he took conservative positions on abortion, gun control, environmental regulation, and other issues. He voted against the creation of the U.S. Department of Education, citing concern over budget deficits and expansion of the federal government, claiming that it was an encroachment on states' rights under the 10th Amendment. He also voted against funding Head Start, but reversed that position in 2000. In 1978, he voted against establishing a national holiday in honor of Martin Luther King Jr., but changed that position in 1983. In April 1980, Cheney endorsed Governor Ronald Reagan for president. In 1986, after Reagan vetoed a bill to impose economic sanctions on South Africa for its policy of apartheid, Cheney was one of 83 representatives to vote against overriding that veto. He was against sanctions against countries, stating they almost never work and may unintentionally harm people instead. In 1986, Cheney joined 145 Republicans and 31 Democrats who voted against a non-binding congressional resolution calling on the South African government to release Nelson Mandela from prison. This was after the Democrats defeated proposed amendments that required Mandela to renounce violence supported by the African National Congress and requiring it to remove the communists from its leadership, and that resolution was defeated. Cheney appeared on CNN saying he opposed the resolution because the ANC at the time was viewed as a terrorist organization and had a number of interests that were fundamentally inimical to the United States. Over his 4 years as Secretary of Defense under President George H.W. Bush from 1989 to 1993, he downsized the military and his budgets showed negative real growth despite pressures to acquire weapons systems advocated by Congress. The Department of Defense's total spending was reduced from $291 billion to $270 billion in today's currency. Total military personnel decreased by 19% from about 2.2 million in 1989 to about 1.8 million in 1993. Given the rising tensions in the Middle East, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia allowed bases for U.S. troops and aircraft, which was critical to the success of the coming Gulf War in 1991, which upset much of the Muslim world, but it was a good call. Cheney led the United States campaign to drive Panamanian ruler General Manuel Antonio Noriega from power after the May 1989 elections, when Guillermo Endara was elected president of Panama. But Noriega overturned the election, established martial law, jailed opponents, and suppressed a military coup. But after his soldiers killed a U.S. serviceman, Marine Lieutenant Robert Paz, on December 16, 1989, the United States invasion of Panama began under Cheney's direction in December 1989. Noriega was already wanted on drug charges in the United States, and he endangered U.S. lives and property. The mission in Panama was successful, as U.S. forces achieved control of Panama and Endara assumed the presidency while Noriega was convicted and imprisoned on racketeering and drug trafficking charges in April 1992. As vice president under President George W. Bush from 2001 to 2009, Cheney was active and used his influence to help shape the administration's energy policy and foreign policy in the Middle East and around the world. And he was a major shareholder in the Haliburton company. On August 1, 1990, Iraqi President Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, ostensibly over a dispute on Kuwaiti slant drilling into Iraq, which was an operation which later involved the Halliburton company, resulting in Iraq invading Kuwait and moving onto the Saudi Arabian border. Cheney, as SecDef, oversaw the UN coalition, deployment, and ultimate victory. The crisis in Somalia in 1991 and the following relief and military support would devolve and be inherited by the Clinton administration, just as the rising tensions in the former Yugoslavia came to the forefront. After the election loss in 1992, Cheney became a fellow at the conservative think tank American Enterprise Institute. In 1995, he became the chairman and chief executive officer of the Haliburton Company, which supplied technology and services to the oil and gas industries. This was where questions began to arise. In the mid-1990s, a whistleblower had revealed that the company, then known as Brown & Root, a subsidiary, had overcharged the government on a contract to convert military bases to civilian use, including Saudi Arabia. From October 1, 1995 to July 25, 2000, Cheney was chairman and chief executive officer of Haliburton, and although he resigned as CEO after he was announced as George Bush's vice presidential running mate in the 2000 election, he still had a financial stake. Cheney's record as CEO also fell under scrutiny among Wall Street analysts, and the Securities and Exchange Commission looked into it. They looked back into the 1998 merger between Halliburton and Dresser Industries, which brought criticism of some Dresser executives for Halliburton's lack of accounting transparency. Halliburton was already under deep scrutiny as one of its subsidiaries, Kellogg Brown & Root, was given the Logistics Civil Augmentation Program contract, better known as LOGCAP, for the U.S. Army in 2001. The contract was worth more than $31 billion, and it was a no-bid award, which violated federal procurement law. Government auditors complained that KBR refused to turn over electronic data in its native format and stamped documents as proprietary and secret when the documents would normally be considered public records as required for government contracts. This accusation gained momentum after the invasion of Iraq. Cheney played a central and controversial role in conveying intelligence reports that Saddam Hussein had developed or had retained weapons of mass destruction in violation of resolutions passed by the United Nations and the ceasefire agreement of 1991. After human inspectors under Hans Blix were refused return entry to target sites in Iraq for inspection, Cheney used these reports to initiate the war in Iraq while vice president under George W. Bush. Cheney continued to allege links between Saddam Hussein and al-Qaeda, despite President Bush having a classified President's Daily Briefing on September 21, 2001. In this meeting, the U.S. intelligence community presented no evidence linking Saddam Hussein to the September 11th attacks, and that there was scant credible evidence that Iraq had any significant collaborative ties with al-Qaeda. Cheney continued to claim that Saddam had a 10-year relationship with al-Qaeda, but the 9/11 Commission also concluded that there was no collaborative relationship between Iraq and al-Qaeda. Cheney brought up the history of Saddam gassing the Kurds as his proof of his retention of weapons of mass destruction. However, after the initial destruction of those gas munitions by Hans Blix and his inspection team, it was believed that other WMDs that could be found, primarily gas, but many believed that they had already been moved to Syria. After the fall of Saddam, Cheney's former company, Haliburton, secured very lucrative no-bid reconstruction contracts for bases from the U.S. government. Cheney was often criticized for the Bush administration's policies regarding the campaign against terrorism, for his support of wiretapping by the National Security Agency, and for his endorsement of the U.S.'s enhanced interrogation torture program. Ironically, his political life was always connected to the financial fortunes of the Halliburton Company and its subsidiaries, which continued to secure amazing no-bid contracts. Without allowing other companies to bid for these federal contracts, corruption was suspected, but the situation would get worse with allegations that damaged Cheney's public reputation. Critics accused him of not disclosing his personal and financial involvement with Haliburton while he was formulating American and global energy policy, where Haliburton was the primary contractor. These condemnations included members of Congress, who brought suit against him for not disclosing those records connecting his finances used to form the national energy policy. Cheney may have resigned as CEO, but he did not divest himself of his shares, as he continued expanding energy contracts in and out of office. In 2005, Tony Menendez of Halliburton's accounting office blew the whistle on Halliburton's accounting practices when he reported irregularities and illegal practices to the Securities and Exchange Commission. The investigation expanded and proved major irregularities, but the blowback cost Menendez 9 years of his life fighting in the courts. But Haliburton finally did pay his legal fees, and the company suffered no penalties. As a result of Menendez's information, Halliburton shareholders pursued a class action lawsuit alleging that the corporation artificially inflated its stock price during this period, though Cheney was not named as an individual defendant in the suit. But Halliburton, having such great global reach on oil, gas, and construction, continued getting contracts unavailable to other companies, which only raised more allegations of corruption. This image was expanded upon when it was learned what Halliburton had been doing all along. Due to the rising controversies, investigations, and the lack of profits justifying keeping the company, Halliburton sold KBR in 2007. Halliburton officials said KBR's war contracts weren't adding much to the oil company's profits. But Halliburton did own KBR during the height of KBR's activities in Iraq, where the criminal conduct was alleged. More than likely, Halliburton wanted to distance itself from the one subsidiary under scrutiny. That same year, Halliburton opened a second headquarters in Dubai, in the United Arab Emirates, to emphasize its identity as a worldwide oil services company. The Department of Justice fraud lawsuit specifically stipulated that KBR was overcharging the government between 2003 and 2006, overbilling on services. Many of those services were never rendered following the Menendez complaint. It was during these years that Halliburton owned the company, which explained why they divested from KBR. On July 11, 2009, CIA Director Leon Panetta told the Senate and House Intelligence Committees that the CIA withheld information about a secret counter-terrorism program from Congress for 8 years at Cheney's request. That program was an attempt to carry out a 2001 presidential authorization to capture or kill all al-Qaeda operatives without congressional oversight, but more accusations came. In April 2010, the U.S. Justice Department filed a civil fraud case against KBR, now separate from Haliburton, over the issue of using private security forces in Iraq to protect its workers and subcontractors. Private security was not allowed under the LOGCAP contract because the U.S. military was supposed to provide protection, which was cheaper than private security. The lawsuit alleged that internal documents showed KBR executives knew private security wasn't allowed, but they charged the government for it anyway. While the lawsuit doesn't put a dollar amount on those billings, the director of the Defense Contract Audit Agency said the total came to more than $99 million. KBR denied any wrongdoing and said in a response to the lawsuit that the government had known for years that KBR was hiring private security, and KBR only did so because its employees were being left unprotected by the military. In June 2011, the United States Supreme Court reversed a lower court ruling and allowed the case to continue in litigation, and Cheney was named in a December 2010 corruption complaint filed by the Nigerian government against Halliburton when it owned KBR, which the company settled for $250 million. Yet, when the full report was released, it showed that Haliburton, its shareholders, and Dick Cheney were raking in a lot of taxpayer money by fraud. The GAO issued a report that offered further evidence that the administration's contracting in Iraq was dishonest. Since September 11, 2001, the company had constructed base camps at more than 60 locations throughout the Middle East and South Asia. The report, titled Rebuilding Iraq, Fiscal Year 2003 Contract Award, proving no contract bids were awarded and overbilling by Halliburton and KBR, and illegally given the task of developing contingency plans for Iraq's oil infrastructure, were irregular at best. Haliburton was later given the no competition bid for a $7 billion sole source oil infrastructure contract. Over the course of several years, the Defense Contract Audit Agency found that $553 million in payments should be disallowed to KBR and clawed back, according to the 2009 testimony by Agency Director April Stevenson before the Bipartisan Commission on Wartime Contracting in Iraq and Afghanistan. Basically, America's war on terrorism created a windfall for KBR and Halliburton. Under its log-cap contract deal with the Pentagon, KBR was the go-to company to provide troops in Iraq with everything from portable toilets to internet cafes. In the past, critics have faulted the government for failing to supervise private contractors. Brown and Root agreed to pay a $2 million fine but admitted no wrongdoing. But just as they settled that corruption scandal, they were involved in others, and Cheney and his fellow shareholders were still raking in the money. The Securities and Exchange Commission charged Halliburton Company with violating the books, records, and internal accounting controls provisions of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, or FCPA, while selecting and making payments to a local company in Angola to obtain lucrative oilfield contracts. These were basically bribes. The executive chairman, Economic and Financial Crimes Commission, Mr. Ola Olukoyede, said that Nigeria lost out on the Halliburton scandal that broke out in the country, while the United States of America, where some persons were investigated, prosecuted, and convicted, raked in over $3 billion from that scandal. In essence, Halliburton and KBR paid bribes to high-ranking Nigerian government officials between 1994 and 2004. Halliburton and his subsidiaries eventually reached a deal with the U.S. Department of Justice to pay $382 million to settle the bribery case. While some individuals were prosecuted and sentenced, others made plea bargains with the American authorities. Halliburton also agreed to obtain an independent compliance consultant to oversee its anti-corruption policies and procedures in Africa, primarily referring to the case in Angola. Halliburton's former vice president, Janot Lawrence, agreed to pay a $75,000 penalty for causing the company's violations, circumventing internal accounting controls, and falsifying books and records. Halliburton agreed to pay an additional $14 million in disgorgement plus $1.2 million in prejudgment interest and a $14 million additional penalty to make the case go away. But that was a drop in the bucket. In 2010, Nigeria indicted former U.S. Vice President Dick Cheney, who was CEO of Halliburton before he was elected during that time of the bribery scandal, only to later clear him when Halliburton worked out a $35 million settlement to make it go away. That was a really great payoff. British lawyer Jeffrey Tesler had helped launder money and handle the bribes for Halliburton. In 2012, at his sentencing hearing after pleading guilty to U.S. corruption charges for his role in the Halliburton bribery scandal, he laid out how it worked. Tesler said that he began planning the bribe payments in 1994 and transferred small amounts of money through Switzerland in July 1996. But by 2003, his role had escalated. In April 2003, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers awarded a no-bid contract to extinguish oil well fires in Iraq to KBR, then owned by Halliburton. They used a network of secretive banks and offshore tax havens to funnel $182 million in bribes to those Nigerian officials in exchange for $6 billion in engineering and construction work for an international consortium of companies that included a then Haliburton subsidiary. Tesler said that in the Nigerian capital, Abuja, he had directed the drop-off of a travel bag stuffed with $1 million in $100 bills in the foyer of a luxury hotel where the per-night cost of a suite can exceed the nation's average annual income of $3,000. It was one of at least 20 money transfers that Tesler admitted that he made or directed. The cash was destined for Nigeria's ruling party via the state-owned oil and gas company, the Nigerian National Petroleum Corporation, according to an official Nigerian report. This was to ensure that Haliburton through KBR received those contracts. With concerns over the forthcoming Nigerian election, which could have derailed the business agreements in April 2003, the government party scored an overwhelming victory in an election marred by clear vote rigging, fraud, and violence that killed at least 100 people. The leaked investigation files revealed that Tesler had directed financial ties to two former Nigerian officials, now retired Major General Chris Garuba, Chief of Staff to the former Nigerian President Abusalami Abubakar, who himself allegedly received bribes as president. The other recipient was Andrew Agam, a senior government official who was going to testify, but he was killed during an attack on his motorcade. Ironically, Agam was a board member of the People's Democratic Party, which controlled the government when this affair unfolded. With his legacy tarnished by scandal and corruption, Cheney went on a rehabilitation tour after 2010 when he suffered his fifth heart attack. 2 years later, he had a heart transplant. His autobiography, In My Time, a personal and political memoir, co-written with his daughter Liz Cheney, was published in 2011. Cheney also wrote with his heart surgeon, Hart, An American Medical Odyssey in 2013. Soon, Liz Cheney will have her own Most Corrupt video. But she did author, with her father, another book, Exceptional, Why the World Needs a Powerful America, in 2015. Dick Cheney was never held personally accountable for any of his shady dealings while holding elected and appointed office. The company that he chaired and remained a major shareholder in illegally made billions and bribed officials. Today, Dick Cheney's net worth is estimated to be around $150 million, which is pretty good for a former member of Congress, Secretary of Defense, and Vice President who was at the center of formulating foreign energy policies and securing uncontested government contracts.
Thank you for watching this episode of Forgotten History. If you liked what you saw, please click like, share, and subscribe. And if you would like to assist with the ever-increasing cost of production, please consider becoming a channel member and joining our Patreon page. Please check out our merchandise store. And thanks for watching.